Welcome to the media and the public watching on our live stream on social media. I'm Monique Tautse, I manage AFriforum's campaign department. Next to me is Kali Kriel, our CEO, and Adams Roots, our head of policy and action. AFriforum would like to announce that we are launching a comprehensive international campaign today, and as part of this campaign we will be visiting countries across the globe to make sure that the world knows about what is happening regarding civil rights in South Africa. Some of the issues that we will be discussing will be expropriation without compensation, as well as farm murders and hate speech. We will also be publishing a report today on how the rights of minorities are being violated in South Africa. Firstly, I would like to hand over now to Kali Kriel, who will be talking about AFriforum's international strategy.
Thank you very much, Monique. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Maybe I just want to start off by saying, from AFriforum's side, we are committed to creating a better future in South Africa. And when we say that, we mean a better future for every single person in this country, but we are also not ashamed to say that we also want to make sure that there is a future for minority communities such as Afrikaners. And if we say that is our goal, to create a better future, then we have to identify those aspects that create a threat for this better future. And in the report that Monique mentioned, numerous aspects are addressed. I just want to mention two. Let's start off with expropriation without compensation. Why we believe it is not in the interest of every person in this country. You know, many times people bring policies to the fore to say this is pro-poor policies. But in the end, those very people that are supposed to benefit from these policies are those people that also suffer. And it's not something that I've just thought of last night. It is something that there are examples in the world of. If you, for instance, look at a place like Venezuela, which was an economic powerhouse in Central America, today we have a 90% unemployment rate, a shortage of food, and people are suffering. If we look at an African example, we go to Zimbabwe. There's also a 90% unemployment rate in Zimbabwe. There are fuel shortages. So what we see, when you disrespect property rights, you don't only affect those few people that have farms. If you look at the AFriforum's membership base of 235,000 people, a minority of them have land. The vast majority of our members are in cities and urban areas. So they won't be affected if, for instance, farmland would be taken directly. But the indirect effect on them would be huge. Like we've seen in these examples, there would be hyperinflation, shortages of fuels, rising fuel prices, large unemployment. And we have an obligation not only to our members, but to every person in this country to make sure that we fight this with everything we have. This is not just another campaign from AFriforum's side. This goes to the heart of our country and the future of our country. And we cannot sit by and watch people experimenting with things that have failed elsewhere and that are also going to fail here. And that is why we will use every single mechanism at our disposal to fight this in the courts and everywhere else, also in the international community. Then secondly, we are worried that the ANC is breaking the 1994 agreement in numerous senses. You know, if you look at the preamble of the Constitution that says we should also respect people that help build this country, if you look at the ANC allowing some of its senior leaders to make statements that are scapegoating minorities, that is a breaking of the spirit of that agreement. And in a report that will come out, if you break the agreement on property rights, you're breaking the agreement of 1994. If you want a situation where there can be no Afrikaans at public universities, or you have a Panjasa Lesotho that wants to destroy Afrikaans schools, then you are breaking the 1994 agreement. And I think it's in everybody's interest that we make sure that we get down to a situation where we say we have unity in diversity, we respect the various communities' constitutional rights, and we want to foster a society where there's mutual recognition and respect. And the breaking of the 1994 agreement is a deed of disrespect, where we have an obligation towards our members, and I think the country as a whole, to make sure that we take up the struggle to make sure this does not happen. So the question is, what should we do? Our first prize is always to solve problems locally. And on all these positions, we have on many occasions tried our level best in the discussions with the police and government and many other governmental stakeholders to make sure that we try and solve it through discussion. But what unfortunately happens, it seems that you have a ruling party that has become arrogant, that don't listen to a diversity of views in South Africa. And we have even a situation where 180,000 inputs of our members to the Constitutional Review Committee that was formed by the previous Parliament was simply ignored. And you get to a situation to say, well, we want to solve this locally. You mobilize your community to make inputs, and all you get is a government saying, well, we are not even going to look at that. That leaves you, makes your options less, and then you have to say, what should we do? In the second place, it's also created by the fact that as part of the ANC strategy and tactics, and you can go and read their policies on their website, they work on a central principle of the balance of forces, which means they don't work on a principle to say, we want to take the country forward and we will listen to good ideas. That is not what the balance of forces means. It says that they will implement their national democratic revolution, the second phase of it, and they will do so as far as they can, and they will only stop if the balance of forces don't allow them to do so. So this kind of method from the ANC actually forces you to say, we need to get a method to put pressure on them. And in this whole regard, with regard to them not listening to people, with their policy of balance of forces that simply don't listen to people's arguments, and they need to get some form of pressure, we have no other option but to mobilize as much pressure on the ANC as possible. And therefore we have no other option but to go the international route. We need to make sure that we mobilize the international community. At the moment, Cyril Ramaphosa only has pressure from the Ace Magashule side, who doesn't care to destroy the country's economy, and you need counter pressure. And we believe the international community, people that invest in this country, are in a strong position to put pressure on the South African government. We want investments in this country. It's in every one of our interests that we do get investments. And it's not us that's going, we never say to anybody, don't invest in Zimbabwe. What happened is people simply left because they did not want to take the risk of investing in that country. So what we have to make sure that we are proactive before we get disinvestments on a large scale. We need to get those investors and countries to say to the government, this is what's going to happen, and hopefully there will be a counterbalance to make sure that we don't go down this catastrophic route that the ANC is taking us as on the moment. That's more or less the background why we are going international route. Of course, we will continue to try through local discussions to solve these issues, but at this moment we need another instrument to put some pressure on the South African government to make sure that there is a possibility to stop catastrophe from coming to our shores. But Ernst Roots will give you more information on our report that we are launching.
Thank you, Kali. Just before I get to the report, I'm sure you have copies of the report. If you don't have, you can just let us know and we'll make sure you have a copy. You will get a copy. We'll also issue it today with the press statement. Maybe just one comment to link to Kali's point about expropriation without compensation and the negative consequences thereof for everyone in South Africa. I was asked this question in an interview this week or this weekend, and I think it was a very good question, and I think it's worth maybe just repeating that here. So the question was, if we're so against expropriation without compensation, what do you do in the following scenario? And the scenario is, there is let's add race to the scenario. So there's a black township or a black community that lives in a particular area. They don't have proper housing. And next to them there's a farm or a small holding. That's the example that was given, is that it's 30 hectares in size, and there's a white farmer who lives on it and he only uses 3 hectares. So how could it not be in the interest of South Africa to say, this person has this much land and there's a community that doesn't have that land, to say, let's take 27 of those hectares and redistribute it. It obviously sounds like a good idea. And I think there's a lot that could be said about that, but one way to answer that is, there was a book written in the 1940s by an economist, Henry Hazlitt, and the book is called Economics in One Lesson. And it's a very useful way to explain a scenario like this. And Henry Hazlitt said that to understand if an idea regarding an economic, or to understand whether an economic idea or policy is a good idea, you should not ask the question, what will the immediate response of this policy be? Because oftentimes, with grand and radical economic policies, the immediate response sounds like a very good idea. The question you should be asking is, what will the consequences of the immediate consequence be? And in this example, it sounds like a good idea to say, well, everyone should just have equal amount of land. But what would the consequences there be? The consequence would be that there would be a government policy that says, if you are an entrepreneur, if you develop wealth, then you will be punished by the government. Your wealth will be taken from you. So that effect, the consequence thereof would be that people who are entrepreneurs would leave the country. And the consequence would be that people would not want to invest in South Africa, because their investments would be taken away from them by the government and redistributed. So the consequence thereof, although it sounds like a good idea at first, the consequence would be bad for everyone in this country. And it's important to understand, many of these economic ideas sound wonderful at first glance, but you need to ask, what's going to happen after the policy is implemented? What will the consequences of the consequence be? So to get to the report, I'm not going to go through the whole report, but I'm going to highlight some of the aspects in this report. And the reason why we have this report is, we've been asked many times in the past by people, why do we even need a minority rights organization in South Africa? Why does AFriforum even exist? Because minorities, you can look at minorities in South Africa and you will see that they are wealthier than the average person in South Africa, and so forth. Minorities still dominate the country. That's what we hear. So if we say minorities are being persecuted or their rights are being violated, why do we say this? And the report is an attempt to summarize this in an easily readable way. So over the weekend, we had members of the ANC and the South African Communist Party protesting outside the United States Embassy, chanting, "One American, one bullet." And the reason why this is relevant, and the reason why we added this example to the report, is because there's a fundamentally anti-Western approach or ideology, if you want to use that term, within the ruling party in South Africa, and we can see that on many levels. We can see it in the conspiracy theories about regime change. We heard the former Secretary General of the ANC say that they know there's a conspiracy in the United States Embassy to have a regime change in South Africa. We know that South Africa is among the top 10 countries voting against, for example, the United States at the United Nations. We know the ANC wanted to change the names of the streets in which the United States Embassy is based to Fidel Castro Street and Che Guevara Street. We know, I think it was last year, when the South African ambassador in Venezuela said at a public gathering that the South African government is prepared to take up arms and send soldiers to the United States to fight the United States. And then we have this strange hero worship of some of the world's worst human rights violators. And we can go down the list. We can talk about the atrocities committed by people like Muammar Gaddafi, people like Robert Mugabe, like Hugo Chavez, like Omar al-Bashir, and so forth. And I think in more extreme cases, Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong. We had the ANC, for example, say they want to rename one of the main streets in Pretoria to Mao Zedong because he should also be celebrated in South Africa for the role he played in building the relationship between South Africa and China. And the reason why I'm mentioning this is because there's this very strong anti-Western view, and then within the same context we have the ANC take that line also with minorities in South Africa who identify, for example, with Western values. It's as if identifying with Western values by definition makes you an imperialist, that imperialism and being Western is exactly the same thing. We are Africans. We regard ourselves as Africans, although many of AFriforum's members would also say that they hold Western values. But to hold Western values is regarded by the ANC as by definition being imperialist, as if other civilizations in this world have never committed imperialism. So we had, for example, to get to a practical example, we had the Secretary General of the ANC, Ace Magashule, say, blaming the xenophobic violence in South Africa on a third force, and then suggesting that it's Western powers that should be blamed for xenophobia in South Africa. And then he went even further, and I'm sure you know the quote, but I'm just going to read it from the report, where Ace Magashule said, you are, of course within the context of the xenophobic violence we saw last year, he said, you are South Africans, but remember, you are Africans, living in a continent called Africa. Never despise people who have the same skin color as us. There are many others with a whitish color. You don't know them, they are there. You see them all the time, but you can't say this one, kele kwere kwere. They have never been attacked because they are also foreigners, but because their color is white. Now you can interpret this in different ways, but I think it's safe to say that this is at least a subtle way to suggest that if you want to attack and commit violence inflict violence upon foreigners, don't do it. Don't make black people your target. Make sure that your target is white. And it is something that we believe should be taken very seriously. That's unfortunately not the only example of romanticizing of violence that we've seen by the members of the South African government or the ruling party. We know even till today the song Kill the Boer is still being sung at some gatherings. We know about the history of the song Dubula Ibunu, which means shoot the Boer. We know, and I'd like to read this to you, and I think we should all know, we're all supposed to know this, but at the centenary gathering of the ANC, when former President Jacob Zuma, who was the president then, at this big ANC gathering, he burst into song and he sang, "We are going to shoot them with the machine gun. They are going to run. Shoot the Boer. We are going to hit them and they are going to run. We are going to shoot them with a machine gun. They are going to run. Shoot the Boer. We are going to hit them and they are going to run. The cabinet is going to shoot them with a machine gun." Songs like this has become normalized in South Africa, while we can just imagine if a president of any other country were to sing a song like this, in which a minority community in his country is targeted, there would be an international outcry. Well, in this particular example, it wasn't even regarded as a very newsworthy event, which is another cause of great concern to us. Then we do know this report is not about opposition parties, but it's worth mentioning some of the comments at least made by the leader of the economic freedom fighters, Julius Malema. We know about the comment where he said that he is not calling for a slaughtering or a genocide of white people, at least for now, but that he cannot guarantee the future. And we know that shortly thereafter he said that the EFF and he intends to slit the throat of whiteness. Now, why is this relevant? Because just a few days thereafter, President Cyril Ramaphosa said, after Malema said this, he said that they would like Julius Malema to come back to the ANC because they can see that he is still ANC deep down in his heart. And again, to have a person like this being welcomed or invited to join the ruling party after making comments like this is extremely alarming. There's a section in the report about the ruling parties and the government's distorted position on minority rights and democracy. We heard, for example, former President Jacob Zuma say in Parliament, we have more rights because we are the majority, you have less rights because you are the minority. Absolutely, that is how democracy works. And we've had people after that say he misspoke or his quote was taken out of context and so forth. But what the former president said there is very much in line with what many other intellectual leaders in the ruling party have said. We've heard, for example, during the negotiations for a new South Africa that Paulo Jordan at that time said that the ANC understands the importance of minority rights, but the ANC would not accept minority rights in a new South Africa because their definition of minority rights is a continuation of apartheid. We've had many similar comments. More recently, we had the spokesperson for the ANC publicly referred to an outbreak of riots in Eldorado Park, I believe, where there was a community, a colored community, who was protesting about developments at their school that they were not happy with. And the spokesperson for the ruling party said, these people should not feel, referring to colored people in South Africa, they should not feel as if they have been denigrated or reduced to the status of a minority community, as if being a member of a minority community means that you have a reduced status with regard to your rights. And of course there are many other such examples. Maybe a comment on equality. Equality is of course a controversial topic because there are many different definitions of equality, and when you say, I've never encountered anyone who says they are against equality, but when you say you want to promote equality, the first question should be what's the definition of equality? And it's very clear that the ruling party in South Africa and the government in South Africa's definition of equality is nothing else than racial representativity. And we've seen that with various legislations, various laws that's currently in place in South Africa. And it's interesting, for example, that to this date, we know that the Populations Registration Act of, I think, 1952, if I recall, was repealed because it's racist to have a piece of legislation that categorizes people according to the color of their skin. So the act was repealed, but then the government continues by doing the same thing, but only without an act that does that. So, for example, in the South African legal system, there's no definition for what it means to be a white person. There's a definition for what it means to be black, and the ANC has a definition for what it means to be African, but there's no definition for what it means to be white. But we do know that there's severe levels of discrimination against white people in various levels of society. We also know that the PEPUDA, the Equality Act, speaks about categories of people. And why this is significant is because the Act particularly makes it very clear that people in South Africa should be categorized. And we all know how they should be categorized. They should be categorized according to the color of their skin, and the color of their skin determines how they should be treated. So the focus is not socioeconomic status. The focus is not, are you unemployed, do you have property or whatever. The focus is simply, are you white or are you black? And that will determine how you are treated. That's something that is a major concern to us. I want to read to you two more quotes from the report with regard to the quota system and racial categorization. So on page 7 we quote who was Butana Kompela, who was a former chairperson of the National Assembly's Portfolio Committee on Sport and Recreation, who said that the Constitution requires transformation and doing away with this policy would be treason. This despite the fact that transformation is a word that doesn't appear in the Constitution and nor does racial quotas. And then we had the former head of policy of the ANC, Joel Netshitenzi, who said that transformation entails that all levers of power must be brought under the control of the national liberation movement, and that they should reflect in their composition the demographics of the country, and they should owe allegiance to the new order. So that's the ANC's head of policy's definition of what transformation means. So you can say transformation is a good thing because we need to move this country forward, but that's not the ANC or the ruling party's definition of transformation. It's not to move this country forward. It's to get as much control as possible, and in the process to discriminate against minorities. Moving to expropriation without compensation, I'm just going to go through some of the statistics to keep it short. We know the comments made, for example, by the state president on this. We know about the comments made by the deputy president and so forth. And we all know we're in the process of changing the constitution to empower the state to expropriate private property without compensation. So maybe just a few. I think the important point here is that the ANC, the ruling party and its allies in this cause, speak about redistribution and restitution as if it's the same thing. Well, restitution is a policy that should be supported, and redistribution, at least the ANC's version thereof, is just simply a racist policy. Restitution is to say that there were historic injustices and these injustices have to be corrected. And it is AFriforum's position that restitution is something that should be supported. And what does restitution mean? It means that you should determine where there were dispossessions of land, at least in this context, and then the people who were deprived of that property should either get the property back, or if they prefer financial compensation, then they should get financial compensation. But the ANC talks about restitution, they talk about correcting historic wrongs, and then when they talk about what their plans are simply taking property that belongs to white people and giving it to black people. As if you are white and you own property, then by definition that makes you an illegitimate owner of the property, regardless of how you got or acquired that property. And if you are black and you do not own property, then by definition the reason why you do not own property is because someone stole the property from you. We do know that this is a gross generalization, and it is racist to make such a claim. They also talk about the urge to have more radical land reform because nothing has been done, or as if nothing has been done since 1994, despite the fact that we've had 25 years of restitution in this country, despite the fact that 1.8 million people have been compensated who have filed land claims, despite the fact that more than 90% of people who have filed land claims those land claims have been settled already. So we've had quarter of a century of reparations and restitution, and now suddenly we need expropriation without compensation because the land issue has not been resolved. We do know also that there's talk about expropriation as if there's this so-called hunger for land for people to want to own farms, while we know that more than 82% of the land claims that have been filed in this country were for for urban property, people filing land claims in cities, not for farms. We know that of the farms that have been redistributed, more than 90% of them have failed, according to government, and it's been repeated many times by government. And their solution to farms failing as a result of land reform is to say, the solution is simple, we need more aggressive land reform. As if having a more aggressive version of a failed policy would not result in a more aggressive failure. And then we also know that of the land that has been redistributed, or at least the land that has been acquired by the South African government, since this process has started, only 6% has been redistributed into private ownership. So the goal is not to give people private property. The goal is for the government to own the land. And I want to read another quote from the report about this. And we know, for example, that more than 90% of people who have filed land claims have said they would rather have money than land. They file a land claim, and then when you get the option, they would say, rather give me financial compensation. And we know, for example, that the President has said this during the State of the Nation, a previous State of the Nation address, and he said that people must change, or suggested at least, that people must change their way of thinking, reprimanding black people for saying that they would rather have money than land, and saying to them that you should rather want land than money. And so we've had Beki Mbile, who was in charge of land restitution support in KwaZulu-Natal, and he explained this. He said, Many of the claimants already have small pieces of land, and some don't even live in those areas where their forefathers were removed from. Some say to us that they don't want more land, and that they don't want more land than they already own, and the risk involved if they ask us to buy them huge pieces of land that will go out of production. The problem with this is that you look at the outcome of the first phase of the land audit. The amount of land that is private land, particularly owned by white people in this country, is still in the region of between 70 and 80%. We can only change the land ownership pattern if people opt for restoration. If they opt for financial compensation, the pattern stays the same. If you take the money, you don't dent the problem that currently exists. So firstly, the numbers provided by Mr. Mbili with regard to land ownership was wrong. But also he's effectively saying that people are wrong to say they would rather want money, and people should change their way of thinking. And it's clear from this that people have then been compensated. If you file a land claim and you are compensated for that, and you choose financial compensation, that was your land claim and the land claim was settled. Then the ANC's view, or the ruling party's view, is despite the fact that that land claim was settled, the injustice, according to them, has not been corrected. So you give the person money, you give compensation, and then afterwards you say the injustice still exists. And now also we need to go and take the property. Which is, in other words, it stresses the fact that this is not about restitution in the first place. This is about taking property that belongs to minority communities and using distorted statistics as your motive for this, and then simply handing it to people based on the color of their skin. Moving on to farm murders, the question about farm murders that is always asked, it's always the first question we get is, why are you concerned about farm murders? Because there were 20,000 murders in South Africa last year, of which farm murders make a very small percentage. And it's true, but the problem with that is, I mean, of course you're welcome to ask that question, but the problem with that question is it pretends that the size of the group is irrelevant. By that logic, we should also say that why are we concerned about the poaching of rhinos? Because the amount of rhinos that are poached in South Africa is extremely small in comparison to the total amount of animals that are poached in South Africa. But we also know how many animals there are in South Africa, particularly if you include the fish in the sea, and talking about poaching and illegal fishing in our seas. Rhinos make up an extremely small percentage of that, but you need to consider how many rhinos are there in this country and how many of them are being killed or poached. So if you want to talk about farm murders, you can say, yes, it makes up a very small percentage of the total amount of murders in South Africa, but you also need to ask the question, how many farmers are there in South Africa? And when you make that comparison, you can clearly see that the amount of farm murders is completely disproportionate. According to the police, the South African Police Service issued statistics about farm murders a few times in the last few years, and according to one report, there were, over a period of stretching more or less 2 decades, according to police statistics, on average during those 2 decades, roughly about 2 farm murders every week and 2 farm attacks every day. Now, we've seen recently that the amount of farm attacks has increased every year for a few years, although we've seen in the last year or two that the amount of farm murders have declined slightly, which say to us that the problem is worsening, but the good news is people seem to look after their safety a bit better. Why is this important, and why is the issue of farm murders important? We're not asking for special treatment of farmers. That's the exact opposite of our position. Our position is we're asking for equal treatment of farmers. And what does that mean, or why do we say that? Because it's a general principle, and it's also accepted by the South African government, that when you deal with a unique crime, you need a unique counter strategies. You need to, and in our context, it's referred to as priority crimes. So no one is saying if you are concerned about cash in transit heists, that you are not concerned about hijackings or other forms of robbery. Or if you are concerned about copper cable theft, as the South African Police Service is and the government is, then you are not concerned about other forms of theft. Or if you are concerned about violence against women and children, then violence against men is not a problem. It's the reason why these crimes are priorities is because the manifestation thereof is unique and the consequences thereof are unique. And in order to combat these crimes, you need a unique counter strategy. And AFriforum supports this, and we're also asking for equal treatment with regard to farm murders. In other words, a recognition that farm murders is a unique crime, and it needs to be responded to with a focused and a unique counter strategy. That's all we are asking. What we are getting, unfortunately, is when AFriforum went to the United States in 2018, during our visit to Washington, we heard President Ramaphosa say in Parliament, calling on us to come back to South Africa. And then after that, former Minister of International Relations, Lindiwe Sisulu, said that AFriforum was lying to the international community, and the South African government intends to set these facts straight, to tell the truth about South Africa. And we know, I'm sure most of us or all of us have seen the clip of what their version of the truth about South Africa is, which is, as was said by the president of the country, that there are no farm murders in South Africa and there are no land grabs in South Africa. And we regard this also as not only as a denial of a serious problem, but also as an attack on AFriforum as a civil rights organization, because it's an attempt to discredit the work that we are doing to make sure that civil rights, and in this case also minority rights, are protected, which is why we wrote a letter last week to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on minority rights. We have received confirmation of receipt from the letter, and we will of course take the matter from there. So there are more in the report. I'm not going to deal on all of it, but the point is that we are concerned that there's a variety of spheres of society in South Africa in which minorities are discriminated against. We have no intention of describing to anyone else how they should conduct their lives. Our campaign is simply to say that where minorities are discriminated against, this is something that we believe should stop. And we also believe that we want to oppose a system where a government prescribes to minority communities how they should conduct themselves. And I'm not talking about obvious legal issues like, I'm not talking about not committing crimes. I'm talking about the way in which you run your business and so forth. So I think that's a summary of the report. We can talk about, if there are more questions about that, we can gladly deal with that. But Monique Tauter will elaborate more on what we intend to do in this campaign.
And so AFriforum's international campaign will rest on 3 pillars. The first one is creating awareness about the situation in South Africa. The second one is raising support among opinion makers, governments and decision makers. And the third one is mobilizing South Africans living abroad, as well as foreigners who have an interest in South Africa. So our campaign will begin with a trip to the US in February, where we will be meeting and discussing this report with decision makers in Washington, D.C. And thereafter the campaign will proceed with various visits to countries including Southern America, Europe, Asia, Africa and Australia. We also plan to involve the UN by liaising with forums and role players within the UN with whom AFriforum have not corresponded yet. So in South Africa we want to ask South Africans, you can help with our campaign, give us your mandate, and also ask your friends and family that are living abroad to support AFriforum's campaign. They can do this by becoming a member of Friends of AFriforum. They can also use the information in our report. They can find that on www.theworldmustknow.co.za and use this information to write to their local media and also write to their local politicians or government representatives to ask them also to take a stand about the situation in South Africa. We are now going to open the floor for the media for questions and answers.
Good morning. Karen Pretorius from the NCA. Just 2 quick questions. Excuse me. Firstly, releasing a report like this, do you foresee that it could even create and then obviously going overseas with campaign, that it could even create a greater racial divide in terms of white people, black people and other groups in South Africa? Do you foresee that could be something that could happen? And then secondly, you have been to the UN with some of these issues as well. Just take us on some of the outcomes on that, because can't remember exactly what happened over there. Now you're approaching them again. Some people would say you're trying to have a second bite at the cherry, if you will. Just maybe you can speak to that. Thanks.
Yes, maybe I should just start off with the racial divide. I think what the politicians in the ANC and the EFF would like us to believe is that all black people are the same. Just as many people would want to say, you know, all white people are the same. And our experience is totally different. What we've seen is that these kind of programs we go on, of course, the politicians would be very negative about that, and people that benefit from what is wrong in our country would be very negative about that. But I think the vast majority of South Africans are in a situation right now where they are not happy with what is happening. And we see that in terms of what happened, for instance, when we formed AFriforum's private prosecution unit. Despite all this propaganda from government leaders that try and portray AFriforum in a certain way, we, in the first week after we announced our assistance of the late Mr. Senzo Mahiwa, we received more than 200 cases from black South Africans that are not happy with the way the state is being run because they are failed through what is happening. And if AFriforum is taking on these issues, I don't think we should start to think in compartments to say, you know, if we speak about issues that affect minorities, it is not in isolation into the country as a whole. I think it's in the interest in everybody in the country that we have food security. It's in the interest of everybody in the country that when we take on land reform, we do it in a way that stimulates the economy, because, as I've mentioned, with expropriation without compensation, it would be ludicrous to say that all black people now want property to be taken, because I think we should not underestimate the people of this country to know. The question is, should we go to a situation where Zimbabwe was in? And I think there would be very few people, except those that would benefit from the political elite, like the Julius Malemas and Ace Magashules, that would hand the farms to their friends, like happened in Zimbabwe. The fact is the vast majority of people suffered because of this. And we cannot allow a situation to say, you know, there's going to be a lot of propaganda against AFriforum to say you are creating divisions and so forth. It's not us that you cannot say, you cannot blame the fire brigade because it makes a noise when the arsonists are starting a fire. This fire is being started by political elite that have captured the state, that want to benefit, that want to take people's stuff, not for all the people in the country, they want to take the stuff for themselves. And in that sense, I think any person that would realize that would not have a problem with what we are doing. This act of ours is a deed of patriotism. What is a deed or not patriotism is to see our country is going in the wrong direction and to simply just sit back. We are patriots. We are going to fight this. We are fighting this because we also believe it's not only going to benefit minorities, it's in the interest of everybody. And so the divisions would be false anger that is going to be created by the few people on Twitter that sing the same old song. It's not a very nice song, but it's the same old song. If you disagree with them, you're a racist. If you disagree with them, you're disloyal. The people that are disloyal are the people that are taking our country on a route that is going to harm this economy, and that is taking our country to a route where you make you scapegoat people. Those are the polarizing things. So we will go ahead with this, and we believe the only anger there will be is by those people that are benefiting from what is wrong in the country. The second question you asked with regard to, is this now a second bite at the cherry? you know, one should always not be in a position where you don't learn even from people that you disagree with. And we have learned from the ANC in terms of their struggle that started many, many, many decades ago. And it was not when Chief Albert Luthuli went overseas for the first time, everything didn't change. It was a long process we had to continuously convince people to do that. And this is not, we're not naive. You know, we don't think if we go overseas now, everything would change immediately for the better. But we have a long-term view on the country. We don't work for the next election. We work for the next generation and the generations to come. So we owe it to people that would be living in this country in 100 years from now to make sure that we continue to do what we can now. And we have to have a long breath and not give up. And if those people that want to benefit themselves, the political elite, thinks that we will get tired after a year or two, they're making a big mistake. The day I'm not here, there will be many other South Africans that would be willing to continue, and they're already doing so at the moment. This won't disappear. We're in it for a long haul. And the fact is, some things are important enough to fight for. And the future of all of our children is important enough to fight for. And we won't give up. If we're not fully 100% successful this time around, we will go again and again and again until we achieve our goal.
Next question.
Sorry, hi. Hi, it's Louise Erasmus from Jacqueline Magazine. The World Bank has endorsed the ANC's version of expropriation without compensation and said that this would be a positive thing for South African foreign investment. Why is it that you choose to ignore the opinion of the World Bank? You made the argument that land restoration results in often people being far away from the land that they receive. Is this not a perfect argument for expropriation without compensation? Why is it that you claim to have a non-racial approach to, first of all, land redistribution, also inequality, which is a massive problem in the country? Yet, we can see that an alternative to that would be to address the problem based on income and wealth rather than race. Is that something you support?
Yes, let me start off with the last question. Most definitely. We know that in this country you cannot survive if we only have pockets of excellence. We need to make sure that we address the inequality problems in our country, and we are fully committed to play a role in that regard and assist in that regard. We believe the way to tackle inequality is not by giving a few people of the elite the opportunity to have shares in companies again and again and again, because it does not help the poor people on the ground. So when you're going to say, if we really want to break the cycle of poverty in our country, what should be done? We should break the stranglehold that the South African Democratic Teachers Union has on our schooling system. It's heartbreaking to see in every matric result that nearly half the children that go into grade 1 don't get to grade 12. And then you want to be happy about the fact that 80% of those that were luckily enough to get to grade 12, that they passed. We are happy about people passing. So if you say, would we agree with focusing on poverty? Yes, most definitely. We believe that we should have a focus on poverty and not race. With regard to the World Bank, you know, if you have statements like that, you must look at it in the broad context. We are at the verge of a downgrade by Moody's. If you listen to international commentators, as we've heard now in Davos, where people simply don't trust the government anymore. And the real test for the World Bank statement is if people are investing in our country. And there's a lack of investment. So nice words where people are trying to be polite and being diplomatic don't change the fact that we are on the verge of a downgrade.
Yeah, but the World Bank is not being diplomatic. These are according to studies that have been done. And in many, many countries around the world, South Korea, Argentina, and in fact every single modern country, land redistribution has taken place in a very designed and very orderly democratic fashion, which is what we are seeing in South Africa and is what is taking place, despite mischaracterization.
No, I think we agree on the premise to say if it is done if land reform is done in a way that makes it successful, of course, that is also what we support. But what we are seeing now is not land reform, it's a form of nationalization, because government don't give the land to individuals, they keep it for themselves. If you read an Afrikaanse newspaper over the weekend, they did a study on all the land that the government has taken over, and less than half of that there are people busy with what is work that being done there. If you look at corruption, there's large-scale corruption, there's a lack of capacity, and if, let me say it's not me, let's just take the former President Galema Motlanthe. This is not a debate, let me finish and then you can answer. If you look at that high-level report from former President Galema Motlanthe, he said the constitution should not change, and he identified two problems. And those problems is in the first place corruption, they are in the first place corruption, and in the second place, the problem that they identified is the lack of capacity that we have because of cadre deployment. That is the real problem. And we're not against that. But because that has failed, now they simply want to continue with a further process, as Aaron's mentioned quite well, to say, if you have a failed policy and you're going to implement it more aggressively, you will have a more aggressive failure. And that is what we are against. We are in favor of a structured approach where corruption is taken out and where people are equipped. What is happening now, black farmers are set up for failure because they don't have access to capital. No one, except if you're very rich, if you George Soros would be able to fund a farming program through its own capital. But normal people have to borrow money to be able to plant and to be able to have a good crop. But if you don't get property rights, like this fact is what is happening in South Africa, 94% of land that was taken, people don't get property rights. So they cannot get funding and they're going to fail.
Okay, there are a number of things there to respond to. Firstly, the idea that all this land was taken and was not redistributed, that is because in every single country around the world, especially one where our infrastructure is broadening out, it is the function of government to expropriate land in order to build roads, in order to build power lines, in order to build things that are for the public good. And yes, this is a continuation of that function of government, to expropriate land as per the Constitution that is for public good. And that is what we are seeing with this bill. So you talk about all kinds of things, farming, needing capital. Are you making an argument that we could expand farming with an investment in black farmers? And you know, this is exactly what this is about. So I don't understand why you make an argument to say that this is a failed policy when that policy is being addressed by going after it more aggressively. You're against that for some reason. Are you just against transformation altogether?
A very nice statement you made. I'm willing to go in the debate with you at any time, but I don't think that's the forum. But let me state it again. We've said that we are in favor of developing people, but it's ludicrous if you say what is happening now is an accepted principle of governments. When governments expropriate, they pay. What we see now is governments wants to expropriate and they don't pay. And that is what we've seen. If you say that is a principle, that might have been a principle in China. It might have been a principle in the USSR. It was a principle in Zimbabwe. So if you want to say that's an international accepted principle, it is accepted for those states that want to fail. And we don't want to fail state. I can go into a debate with you later. Are there any other questions?
It's accepted across the world.
To take property without paying.
Can I
Okay.
think that
Ernst, can I just say, are you a journalist or an activist? So, if you want to be an activist, you... No, you're not asking questions, you're making statements. You're more than welcome to make those statements, but let's just get the questions first, and then we'll look at that.
Any further questions?
Throw some softball down the plate, guys.
No, thank you. We appreciate that you came. We believe in media freedom, so you are more than willing to write. But what we also need in our country as leads is that people are not intolerant towards people that don't agree with them. We're not saying you have to agree with us. We can debate those kind of issues, but to be intolerant and to use your position as a journalist to go into an argument, you're welcome to ask questions, but what you are doing at the moment is unfortunately not journalism. And I think it's bad for journalism, because one of the pillars of democracy is a strong media where people trust, which is a platform for debate. It's not a platform for activism, and I'm sorry that we've seen that today.
This is the end of the conference. We would like to thank AFriforum's 235,000 members, making us the biggest civil rights organization in Africa.